In the pantheon of military history, some names are synonymous with victory, others with folly. But few are as deeply intertwined with tragedy, paradox, and the agonizing moral collapse of a nation as Friedrich Paulus. He was the quintessential German staff officer, meticulous, brilliant, and unswervingly loyal. He rose to become a field marshal in Hitler's Wehrmacht, the highest rank in the most formidable army of its time. Yet his marshal's baton, bestowed upon him by the Führer in the final, desperate hours of a doomed battle, was not an honor but a death sentence, a gilded invitation to suicide. The stage for this drama was Stalingrad, a city on the Volga that became the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, a frozen hell that would not only change the course of the Second World War, but also shatter the soul of the man tasked with its capture. Trapped, starved, and frozen with the remnants of his once mighty Sixth Army, Paulus faced an impossible choice: obey his leader's fanatical demand for a glorious death, or defy the very code of honor that had defined his life to save what was left of his men. His decision to surrender on January 31, 1943, the first German Field Marshal in history to be taken alive, was an act of defiance that stunned the world. But the story did not end there. In a twist that neither Berlin nor the world could have predicted, the Soviets did not execute him. Instead, they cultivated him. The loyal Nazi planner of Operation Barbarossa, the architect of the invasion of the Soviet Union, would slowly, agonizingly be transformed into Moscow's most potent propaganda weapon. Friedrich Paulus, the symbol of Nazi military might, would take to the airwaves to call for the overthrow of the very man he once served with blind devotion. What forces could compel such a profound transformation? How did a man steeped in the Prussian traditions of duty and obedience become a voice for his enemies? This is the story of that metamorphosis, a journey from the command bunkers of the Third Reich to the propaganda studios of the Soviet Union. It is the story of Friedrich Paulus, the field marshal who abandoned Hitler not on the battlefield, but in the depths of his own conscience. To understand the man who surrendered at Stalingrad, one must first understand the world that forged him. Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus was born on September 23, 1890, in Cuxhaven, Germany, the son of a schoolteacher. His origins were modest, a fact that set him apart from the aristocratic Junker class that traditionally dominated the German officer corps. This middle-class background instilled in him a powerful ambition and a meticulous devotion to his work, as if constantly needing to prove his worth. His early aspirations were not for the army, but for the sea. He applied to become a cadet in the prestigious Imperial German Navy, but was rejected. Undeterred, he briefly studied law at the University of Marburg before finding his true calling. In February 1910, he enlisted as an officer candidate in the 111th Margrave Ludwig Wilhelm Infantry Regiment. Here he found a home. The structured, hierarchical world of the German military resonated with his ordered and analytical mind. In the army, Paulus was not a swashbuckling frontline leader, but a quiet, studious, and exceptionally competent staff officer. He was a man of maps, timetables, and logistics. During World War I, he served with distinction on multiple fronts, but primarily in staff roles within the elite Alpenkorps. He was not the type to lead a bayonet charge. He was the one who ensured the charge was supplied, timed, and supported. This experience cemented his reputation as a brilliant planner, a desk general whose battlefield was the grid of a map. The end of the war and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles saw the once mighty German army reduced to mere 100,000 men. For officers like Paulus, who remained in the new Reichswehr, it was a time of profound crisis, but also of quiet, determined rebuilding. He served in a series of staff and command posts, always excelling, always earning the respect of his superiors for his diligence and intellectual rigor. He was deeply involved in the secret development of armored warfare tactics, working under the tutelage of luminaries like Oswald Lutz and Heinz Guderian, the architects of the Blitzkrieg. On a personal level, Paulus found stability in his marriage to the Romanian aristocrat Alina Rossetti Salescu in 1912. She was his confidant and anchor, a connection to a more cultured, cosmopolitan world beyond the rigid confines of the barracks. But professionally, his world was the German army. He was in every sense an apolitical soldier, a man who saw his duty as serving the state regardless of the political party in power. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to prominence, Paulus, like many in the officer corps, viewed them with a mixture of professional opportunity and personal distaste for their vulgarity. Yet their promise to restore Germany's military might and cast off the shackles of Versailles was an intoxicating one. For a man whose entire life was the army, the Nazis offered a path back to greatness. By 1935, he was chief of staff for the new Panzer headquarters, and in 1939, he was promoted to a major general and became chief of staff for the German 10th Army. He was at the very heart of the new, revitalized Wehrmacht, a key cog in the machine that Hitler was building for his war of conquest. As chief of staff, first for the 10th Army, later redesignated the 6th Army, and then as Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, OKH, Paulus was instrumental in planning the very campaigns that would plunge Europe into darkness. He was a key author of the invasion plans for Poland in 1939 and for the stunningly successful campaign against France and the Low Countries in 1940. His plans were models of operational clarity and logistical precision. He was at the peak of his profession, a master of the modern mechanized warfare that his army had perfected. His most faithful assignment, however, came in the autumn of 1940. He was tasked with leading the team that would develop the operational plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. For months, Paulus and his staff worked tirelessly, poring over maps, calculating troop strengths, and mapping out the logistics for the largest land invasion in human history. The plan was a marvel of German military doctrine. 3 massive army groups would smash through Soviet defenses, encircle and destroy the Red Army in a series of lightning battles, and seize Moscow before the onset of winter. There is a terrible tragic irony in this. Friedrich Paulus, the man who would become the most famous victim of the Eastern Front, was one of its principal architects. His plan, like the entire German high command, was built on a foundation of hubris and racial arrogance. It fatally underestimated the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, its vast reserves of manpower, and the sheer resilience of its people. It assumed a swift collapse of the Soviet state, a victory within months. It was a gamble of epic proportions, and Paulus was the one who laid out the cards. When the invasion was launched on June 22, 1941, Paulus remained a high-ranking staff officer, observing the campaign from afar. He was a theorist, not a combatant. This distance from the brutal reality of the front, the savage fighting, the massacres of civilians, the unforgiving climate, would prove to be a critical flaw in his understanding of the war he had helped to unleash. His life took a decisive turn in January 1942. The Fuhrer, looking for a new commander for the prestigious 6th Army, the very army Paulus had served as chief of staff during the Polish campaign, chose him. It was a fatal mistake. For all his brilliance as a planner, Paulus had almost no experience in commanding large formations in the field. He had never commanded a regiment. He was being promoted beyond his capabilities, moved from the sterile environment of the headquarters to the chaotic, unpredictable inferno of the Eastern Front. He was a man of paper, thrust into a world of blood and steel.
The Sixth Army, under Paulus's new command, was the tip of the spear for Case Blue, the German summer offensive of 1942. The objective was to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and, as a secondary but symbolically vital goal, to capture the city that bore Stalin's name. Initially, the advance was spectacular. The Sixth Army, a force of nearly 300,000 men, rolled across the sun-baked Ukrainian steppe, seemingly unstoppable. But as they reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August, the nature of the war changed. The open plains gave way to a labyrinth of factories, apartment blocks, and shattered streets. The Blitzkrieg died, and the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, began. Fighting devolved into a brutal, claustrophobic struggle for every building, every floor, every room. German and Soviet soldiers fought with machine guns, grenades, knives, and sharpened shovels in the rubble of the Red October Steel Factory and the Barakati Arms Works. Paulus directed the battle from his headquarters, but he was ill-suited for this kind of attritional warfare. He was indecisive, overly cautious, and increasingly dependent on direct orders from Hitler's headquarters. He continued to feed his divisions into the urban meat grinder, slowly, bloodily gaining ground, but losing the offensive power and maneuverability of his army. Then, on November 19, 1942, the Soviets sprung their trap. In a brilliantly conceived and executed pincer movement codenamed Operation Uranus, two massive Soviet fronts crashed through the weakly held Romanian and Italian flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Within 4 days, the pincers met at the town of Kalach, and the German Sixth Army was completely encircled. Over 250,000 men were trapped in a vast pocket, or kessel, on the frozen steppe. This was the moment that defined Paulus's command and sealed his fate. His immediate instinct, and that of his senior commanders, was to attempt a breakout to the west. But the order from Hitler's headquarters was unequivocal: stand fast, do not retreat, I will supply you by air. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe chief, Hermann Göring, rashly promised he could deliver the 500 tons of supplies a day needed to keep the army alive. In reality, the air bridge was a catastrophic failure, rarely delivering more than a fraction of that amount. Thus began the long, slow agony of the Sixth Army. Inside the Kessel, conditions deteriorated into a Dantean nightmare. Food ran out. The last of the horses were slaughtered and eaten. Ammunition became scarce. Medical supplies vanished, and wounded soldiers died in their thousands from infection and gangrene in freezing, unhygienic cellars. The temperature plummeted to -20, then -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze to death in their foxholes. Lice, filth, and disease were rampant. The once proud Sixth Army was reduced to a huddled, starving, and frostbitten mass of specters. Paulus, isolated in his command bunker, watched his army disintegrate. He sent increasingly desperate messages to Hitler, pleading for permission to surrender or attempt a breakout to save his men. Each request was met with the same fanatical reply: surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold its positions to the last man and the last round. By late January 1943, the end was near. The Soviet forces had sliced the pocket in two and were closing in on the last German strongholds in the city center. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler sent Paulus one final macabre message. Over the radio, he promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The subtext was brutally clear. No German Field Marshal in history had ever surrendered. This was a direct, unspoken order for Paulus to commit suicide. Hitler later fumed, "What hurts me the most personally is that I still promoted him to Field Marshal. I wanted to give him this final satisfaction. He could have freed himself from all sorrow and ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow." But Paulus chose life. Faced with the utter futility of further resistance and the immense suffering of his surviving troops, he made the decision that would define his legacy. On January 31, 1943, a Soviet delegation entered his headquarters in the basement of the Uniform department store. Friedrich Paulus, the newest Field Marshal of the Third Reich, surrendered. Along with him, 22 generals and the 91,000 half-dead survivors of his army went into captivity. For Moscow, the capture of a German Field Marshal was a propaganda coup of immense proportions. For Paulus, it was the beginning of a profound and painful psychological journey. Initially, even in captivity, he remained a loyal Nazi socialist. He insisted on his status, kept to himself, and sternly resisted early Soviet efforts to recruit him for anti-Nazi propaganda. When he learned of the formation of the National Committee for a Free Germany, NKFD, in July 1943, an organization of communist exiles and captured German soldiers aimed at fomenting rebellion in the Wehrmacht, Paulus was appalled. He penned a letter, co-signed by other senior officers, denouncing the organization and forbidding any German soldier from joining. The Soviets, however, were masters of psychological warfare. They were patient. They understood that breaking a man like Paulus required more than coercion. It required the complete erosion of his worldview. They separated him from the most ardent Nazis and placed him in a comfortable dacha outside Moscow, providing him with good food, books, and medical care. They allowed him to be worked on by captured German officers who had already turned against Hitler, most notably General Walter von Seydlitz-Kersbach, who had formed a parallel anti-fascist group, the League of German Officers, BDO. Still, Paulus resisted. His loyalty was to the German state and the army, and in his mind, that was inseparable from its leader, Adolf Hitler. The turning point, the event that finally shattered his allegiance, came on July 20, 1944. News reached him of the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, the Stauffenberg bomb plot. The subsequent purge was savage. Hitler took his revenge not only on the plotters, but on thousands of others, including many of the most respected figures in the German officer corps. Among those implicated and executed was a friend of Paulus's, General Erich Hoepner. This was the catalyst. Paulus finally understood what many already knew. Hitler was not a savior, but a madman who was dragging Germany into absolute destruction. The execution of honorable officers for trying to save their country proved to him that his oath was no longer to a rational leader, but to a destructive tyrant. His loyalty to the institution of the army now demanded he oppose the man who was systematically destroying it and the nation it served. He realized he and his Sixth Army had not been sacrificed for a noble cause, but had been mere pawns in the endgame of a megalomaniac. The transformation was complete. On August 8, 1944, a year and a half after his capture, Friedrich Paulus did the unthinkable. He went before a Soviet microphone and spoke to the German people and the Wehrmacht over Radio Moscow. His voice, calm and resolute, was a thunderclap across Europe. For Germany, the war is lost. This is the result of the state leadership of Adolf Hitler. Germany must renounce Adolf Hitler and the leadership which will lead the state to ruin. I call on you to turn away from the Führer and save the German people from immeasurable suffering.
The broadcast was a sensation. Goebbels' propaganda ministry furiously denounced him as a traitor, claiming he spoke under duress or had gone insane. But the impact was undeniable. Here was a field marshal, a man once at the pinnacle of Hitler's army, calling for his overthrow. For soldiers on the front and civilians at home, it was a devastating blow to morale, a confirmation of their deepest fears that the war was irretrievably lost. This was not a one-time event. Paulus became an active and prominent member of the League of German Officers. He signed anti-Hitler manifestos, wrote open letters to his former comrades, and lent his name and immense prestige to the Soviet propaganda effort.
He appealed to German commanders on other fronts to follow his example and surrender to save the lives of their men. His most dramatic and public act of renunciation, however, would come after the war was over. In 1946, he was brought from the Soviet Union to Nuremberg to testify at the International Military Tribunal. He was called as a surprise witness for the Soviet prosecution. When he walked into the courtroom, a hush fell over the defendant's dock. Hermann Göring's face contorted in a mask of pure rage, shouting, "Ask that dirty pig if he knows he's a traitor. Ask him if he's taken out Russian citizenship." But Paulus was unflappable. In calm, precise, and damning testimony, he outlined the planning of Operation Barbarossa, confirming it was a premeditated war of aggression. He detailed Hitler's direct and fanatical role in the destruction of the Sixth Army, laying the blame squarely at the Führer's feet. His appearance was a surreal and powerful moment. A German Field Marshal, a man once at the pinnacle of Hitler's army, testifying against the very regime he had once served, providing crucial evidence to convict his former colleagues. For men like Göring and Jodl, it was the ultimate betrayal. For Paulus, it was the final public act of a man attempting to reckon with his own past. After Nuremberg, Paulus remained in Soviet custody for several more years. He acted as a military consultant and notably advised Soviet director Vladimir Petrov on his epic 1949 film, The Battle of Stalingrad. It was only after Stalin's death in 1953 that he was finally released. He was not allowed to return to West Germany, where his wife had died in 1949 without ever seeing him again and where he was widely reviled as a traitor. Instead, he settled in the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. He lived a quiet, secluded life in a villa in Dresden, working as a civilian inspector for the police and giving lectures on military history. He remained a controversial and somewhat tragic figure, a ghost of a bygone era. To the west, he was the traitor of Stalingrad. To the East German communist regime, he was a useful symbol of a re-educated German militarist, though he never became a communist himself. Friedrich Paulus died of a neurological disease on February 1, 1957, almost 14 years to the day after he surrendered his shattered army. He was buried in Dresden, a man without a country, caught between two worlds and two ideologies. His legacy is one of profound and unsettling complexity. Was he a traitor who betrayed his oath and his country for a comfortable captivity? Or was he a pragmatist who, having recognized the criminal insanity of his leader, chose the only path available to him to try and shorten the war and save German lives? Was his surrender an act of cowardice or an act of supreme moral courage, defying a culture where death was preferable to dishonor? The grim statistics of Stalingrad offer one perspective. Of 91,000 men who went into Soviet captivity with Paulus, only about 6,000 ever saw Germany again. The vast majority perished from disease, starvation, and exhaustion in the brutal Soviet prison camps. In this light, his surrender did not save them. It only postponed their deaths. Yet his decision must be viewed in the context of the moment. Faced with an order to commit meaningless collective suicide, he chose life. And in captivity, after a long and tortured reevaluation of his loyalties, he chose to actively work against the regime he finally saw as evil. Perhaps the truest assessment is that Friedrich Paulus was a man forged by a system that he served with exceptional skill, right up to the point where that system demanded a human sacrifice he was unwilling to make. He was an architect of a catastrophic war, and for that, he bears historical responsibility. But he was also a man who, in the deepest abyss of defeat, found the capacity to change, to renounce his past, and to speak the difficult truth to a nation deafened by its own Götterdämmerung. His story is not one of hero or a simple villain, but a somber reflection of the German tragedy itself. A tale of duty twisted into complicity, of honor warped into fanaticism, and of the agonizing search for redemption in the ruins of a self-inflicted apocalypse.